Welcome to Nightmare House of Horror. In the space between sleeping and waking, between the familiar and the strange, between what we think we know and what actually is, that's where tonight's story lives. I've built my career exploring these liminal spaces, these cracks in reality where the most profound terrors take root and flourish. What you're about to hear isn't a story about monsters that announce themselves with roars and claws. This is about the kind of horror that whispers, that suggests, that makes you question whether that shadow in your peripheral vision moved on its own, whether that conversation you overheard was actually meant for your ears, whether the person staring back of you from photographs is really the same person you see in the mirror. Tonight, we enter the world of Margaret Peters, who discovered that the most terrifying revelations don't come with dramatic fanfare. They arrive quietly, like noticing your reflection blinks a half second after you do. This is the story of a woman who spent 15 years processing insurance claims, believing she understood the orderly world of risk assessment and statistical probability, only to discover that some calculations serve purposes far beyond human comprehension. Chapter 1. The First Crack. It was 30 minutes past 8 in the evening when Margaret Peters first noticed the impossible street name in claim file number 774923B. She had been working late again, the fluorescent lights in the Meridian Insurance Building humming their familiar tune of corporate dedication, when the detail jumped out at her from the accident report like a typographical scream. Willow Creek Lane. Margaret had lived in Millbrook for 22 years. She knew every street, every shortcut, every dead end in their small Connecticut town. There was no Willow Creek Lane. There had never been a Willow Creek Lane. Yet here it was, typed neatly in the location field of a claim submitted by Patricia Hoffman for a collision that allegedly occurred at the intersection of Willow Creek Lane and Route 9 at approximately 7:45 on a Tuesday evening in November. The coffee in Margaret's Meridian Insurance mug had gone cold hours ago, but she took a sip anyway, tasting the bitter grounds that always settled at the bottom when she worked late. At 43 years of age, Margaret had processed exactly 14,607 insurance claims. She knew the rhythm of tragedy, the predictable patterns of human carelessness and mechanical failure. Street names didn't simply materialize in police reports. She opened the mapping software on her computer and typed in the intersection. The screen flickered for a moment, just long enough for her to notice, then displayed the familiar message, "Location not found." Margaret felt a small knot of satisfaction in her chest. The world still made sense. But something nagged at her as she highlighted the error in yellow and added a note requesting address verification. The police report was otherwise meticulously detailed. Officer Daniel Martinez had documented the scene with his usual thoroughness. Vehicle damage assessments, witness statements, even measurements of the skid marks leading up to the point of impact. 16 feet and 4 inches of rubber on asphalt, curving slightly to the left before straightening into a perfect line that terminated at the rear bumper of Patricia Hoffman's silver Honda Civic. Margaret printed the file and slipped it into her correction folder. Tomorrow she would call the Millbrook Police Department and sort out the clerical error. These things happened. Systems failed. People made mistakes. The universe remained beautifully, predictably ordinary. At 30 minutes past 8, Margaret Peters locked her office and walked through the empty parking lot to her car, completely unaware that she had just encountered the first symptom of a fundamental wrongness that would soon make her question everything she thought she understood about the nature of reality itself. Chapter 2. The Comfortable Routine. At 34 years of age, Michael had built a life of careful predictability, but Margaret Peters' existence was even more precisely calibrated. She arrived at Meridian Insurance every morning at exactly 8:15, bought her coffee from the machine on the second floor at 8:23, and was seated at her desk with her computer booted and her first claim file open by 8:30. Her colleagues had learned to set their watches by her routines. Margaret had joined Meridian straight out of college, drawn by the promise of stability and the satisfaction of bringing order to chaos. Insurance, her supervisor had explained during her interview, was fundamentally about making sense of the senseless. Accidents happened, property was damaged, lives were disrupted, but the insurance industry existed to quantify that chaos, to transform tragedy into manageable numbers that could be processed, approved, and filed away. She excelled at the work. Margaret possessed an almost supernatural ability to spot inconsistencies in claim reports, to catch the small details that revealed fraud or administrative error. In 15 years, she had saved Meridian Insurance approximately $2.7 million by identifying false claims, duplicate filings, and clerical mistakes that might have cost the company significant money. Her annual performance reviews consistently rated her as exceptional, and her salary reflected her value to the organization. Margaret lived alone in a small house on Maple Street, 13 minutes from the office. She had been married once briefly to a man named David who complained that she treated their relationship like another claim file to be processed and organized. The divorce had been finalized on a Tuesday in March, 8 years ago. Margaret remembered the date because she had taken the morning off work and spent the afternoon recalculating her monthly budget to account for her changed circumstances. Her personal life was as precisely ordered as her professional routine. She shopped for groceries every Saturday morning, bought gas every other Wednesday, and paid her bills on the 15th of each month. Margaret found comfort in predictability. In a world where random accidents could destroy lives in seconds, she had created a small sphere of absolute control. On the morning after discovering the Willow Creek Lane discrepancy, Margaret followed her usual routine with mechanical precision. Coffee at 8:23, desk by 8:30, first claim file opened at 8:31. She had forgotten about the impossible street name until she reached for her correction folder and saw Patricia Hoffman's file waiting for her attention. Margaret dialed the Millbrook Police Department and asked to speak with Officer Martinez. While she waited on hold, she noticed that her hands were trembling slightly. Too much caffeine, she told herself. She had been working late too often recently. This is Martinez. Officer Martinez, this is Margaret Peters from Meridian Insurance. I'm calling about report number 4479B from last Tuesday evening. There appears to be an error in the location field. A pause. Then, what kind of error? The report lists the accident location as Willow Creek Lane and Route 9, but I can't find any record of a Willow Creek Lane in Millbrook. Another pause. Longer this time. Margaret could hear papers shuffling in the background. Ma'am, I filed that report myself. The accident occurred at the intersection of Willow Creek Lane and Route 9 at 7:45 p.m. on November 15th. I measured the skid marks personally. Officer Martinez, I've lived in Millbrook for 22 years. There is no Willow Creek Lane. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Finally, Martinez spoke again, and something in his voice had changed. Ma'am, are you feeling all right? Willow Creek Lane runs parallel to Mill Street for approximately 6 blocks. It intersects Route 9 just south of the old Sinclair station. I drive past that intersection twice a day. Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. I'm sorry, Officer Martinez. I must have been looking at the wrong map. Thank you for your time. She hung up the phone and immediately opened the mapping software on her computer. With careful, deliberate keystrokes, she typed, Willow Creek Lane, Millbrook, Connecticut. The map loaded instantly. A thin line appeared on her screen, running parallel to Mill Street for exactly 6 blocks before intersecting Route 9 just south of a gas station marked as Sinclair, closed. Margaret stared at the screen for a full minute, her coffee growing cold in her hands. Then she grabbed her car keys and walked out of the office without a word to anyone. Chapter 3. The Persistent Wrongness. 3 days later, sometime between 9:30 and 10 in the evening, Margaret Peters stood at the intersection of Willow Creek Lane and Route 9, staring at 16 feet and 4 inches of skid marks that curved slightly to the left before straightening into a perfect line. The street was exactly where Officer Martinez had said it would be. The pavement was real beneath her feet. The street sign, slightly faded but clearly legible, read Willow Creek Lane in the standard municipal font used throughout Millbrook. Margaret had driven past this intersection hundreds of times over the past 22 years. She was certain of it, but she was equally certain that she had never seen this street before Tuesday morning. She had spent 3 days in a state of carefully controlled confusion, double-checking maps, calling the town planning office, even driving slowly through every neighborhood in Millbrook to confirm her knowledge of the local geography. Everything checked out. Willow Creek Lane existed. It had always existed. The town records showed it had been established in 1968, named after a small creek that had been diverted underground during the street's construction. Margaret knew she was losing her mind. She had always prided herself on her memory. Her job required precise attention to detail, and she had never made the kind of fundamental error that would cause her to forget an entire street in her own hometown. But the alternative was impossible. Streets didn't simply materialize. Reality didn't restructure itself to accommodate clerical errors in insurance claims. Standing in the cool November air, Margaret tried to construct a rational explanation. Perhaps she had always known about Willow Creek Lane but had never paid attention to the name. Perhaps her brain had cataloged it as just another residential street, filed away in the background of her consciousness where unimportant details lived. Perhaps the stress of working too many late nights had finally caught up with her, creating false memories and impossible certainties. But even as she tried to convince herself, Margaret knew something was profoundly wrong. She walked slowly along the sidewalk, studying every detail of the street that shouldn't exist. The houses were typical for this part of town. Small colonial and Cape Cod styles built in the 70s and 80s, with well-maintained lawns and mature oak trees. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would explain why her mind had apparently edited this entire block out of her personal geography. At the far end of the street, she found number 47 Willow Creek Lane, a small Cape Cod with gray shingles and white trim. In the driveway sat a silver Honda Civic with a damaged rear bumper. Patricia Hoffman's car. Margaret stood on the sidewalk for 17 minutes, watching the house. The windows were dark, except for a blue glow from what was probably a television in the living room. A normal house on a normal street, where a normal accident had occurred. But Margaret knew, with the kind of certainty that bypasses rational thought, that something about this entire situation was fundamentally wrong. She drove home and spent the night sitting at her kitchen table, staring at a printout of Patricia Hoffman's claim file and trying to understand how a street could exist and not exist simultaneously. Chapter 4. The Accumulating Evidence. After 6 sleepless nights of checking and rechecking, Margaret had identified 14 more impossible details in recent claim files. A house fire at an address that had burned down 12 years ago, rebuilt exactly as described in the current claim. A car accident involving a traffic light that the city planning office insisted had never been installed. A slip-and-fall incident in a grocery store that corporate records showed had been demolished in 2003. Each anomaly led Margaret deeper into a labyrinth of verification that always ended the same way. The impossible details proved to be accurate. The traffic light existed. The grocery store was open for business. The rebuilt house stood exactly where the claim said it would be, with fire damage precisely matching the adjuster's photographs. Margaret began carrying a notebook, documenting each discovery with the methodical precision she brought to her professional work. She wrote down addresses, called businesses, drove to locations, took photographs. Every piece of evidence confirmed that her memory was systematically wrong about basic facts regarding her own hometown. On Thursday morning, she called in sick to work for the first time in 6 years and spent the day visiting every location mentioned in the anomalous claims. The addresses existed. The businesses were operational. The intersections were exactly where the report said they would be. Margaret documented everything, building a comprehensive file that proved either her sanity was deteriorating or reality itself was unreliable. By Friday evening, she had reached a conclusion that terrified her more than the prospect of mental illness. The claim files weren't containing errors. They were containing information about a version of Millbrook that was somehow more accurate than her own memories. She sat in her car outside the Meridian Insurance building, staring at the familiar corporate logo and trying to decide whether to return to work on Monday or check herself into a psychiatric facility. Both options felt like admissions of defeat, acknowledgments that the orderly world she had spent 15 years helping to maintain was nothing more than a comforting illusion. At 8:37 that evening, Margaret's phone rang. The caller ID showed Patricia Hoffman's number. "Miss Peters, this is Patricia Hoffman. I wanted to thank you for processing my claim so quickly. The check arrived today, and I have to say, Meridian's customer service has been exceptional." "Mrs. Hoffman," Margaret said carefully, "I haven't processed your claim yet. It's still in my pending file." A pause. "That's strange. I received a settlement check this afternoon for the full amount of my estimate, along with a letter explaining that my claim had been approved and processed by Margaret Peters, senior adjuster. The paperwork has your signature." Margaret felt something cold crawl up her spine. "Mrs. Hoffman, what was the date on the letter?" "Let me check. It's dated next Tuesday, November 22nd. November 22nd was 5 days in the future." After ending the call, Margaret sat in her car for 23 minutes, staring at the darkening sky and trying to process the implications of what she had just learned. Somewhere in the Meridian Insurance Building, a version of herself had already processed Patricia Hoffman's claim, signed settlement paperwork, and authorized payment for an accident that involved streets Margaret had never heard of until this week. The most rational explanation was that she was experiencing a complete psychotic break. The alternative was that time itself had become unreliable, that cause and effect were operating according to rules she didn't understand. Neither possibility offered any comfort. Chapter 5. The Documentation Project. At 20 minutes before midnight, the recording showed Margaret Peters entering the Meridian Insurance Building using her security card, walking directly to her office, and processing 17 claim files with mechanical efficiency. Margaret watched the security footage on her laptop screen with growing horror. The timestamp indicated the recording was from the previous Tuesday night, the same night she remembered leaving the office at 30 minutes past 8 in the evening after discovering the Willow Creek Lane anomaly. But according to the digital record, she had returned to the building at 11:40 and worked until 4:15, processing claims with a speed and precision that exceeded her normal productivity. She had no memory of returning to work that night. The Margaret on the security footage moved with purpose, her body language confident and familiar. She organized files, typed reports, made phone calls, and signed documents with her usual left-handed script. But when Margaret examined the specific claims that had been processed during those lost hours, she found they were all files she had never seen before, involving addresses and circumstances that should have been impossible. 8 grueling weeks of medical tests revealed nothing abnormal. Margaret's brain scans were perfect, her blood work normal, her psychological evaluations consistently rated her as stable and competent. Dr. Rebecca Santos, the psychiatrist Margaret had begun seeing twice a week, suggested that work stress might be causing dissociative episodes, periods where Margaret continued functioning but formed no conscious memories of her actions. "It's more common than you might think," Dr. Santos explained during their Thursday afternoon session. High-functioning professionals sometimes develop elaborate coping mechanisms that allow them to continue working even during periods of psychological distress. Your subconscious mind takes over, following established routines while your conscious awareness essentially goes offline. Margaret wanted to believe this explanation. It was rational, treatable, and didn't require her to question the fundamental nature of reality. But Dr. Santos's theory couldn't account for the impossible details in the claims she had apparently processed during her blackout periods, or for the fact that these details proved accurate when investigated. She had started keeping a detailed journal, documenting every discrepancy between her memories and the evidence. The notebook filled up quickly. November 23rd. Security footage shows me working until 2 a.m. I remember going home at 6 p.m. November 24th. Patricia Hoffman calls to thank me for processing her claim. I have no memory of working on her file. November 26th. Claim processed for fire damage at address that burned down in 2003. Drive-by location, building exists. Shows recent fire damage. November 28th. Auto accident claim for intersection of Pine Street and Oakwood Drive. No such intersection exists in Millbrook according to city maps. Drive to location. Intersection exists. Fresh accident debris still visible. The pattern was unmistakable and impossible. During periods Margaret couldn't remember, she was processing insurance claims for events that occurred at locations that shouldn't exist but did. The claims were always accurate, the locations always real, the circumstances always verifiable. By December 15th, Margaret had documented 47 anomalous claims processed during blackout periods. Each one led her deeper into a version of Millbrook that didn't match her lifelong knowledge of the town, but which proved to be more accurate than her memories. Chapter 6. The Research Phase. 3 weeks into December, Margaret discovered the Meridian Insurance Company had been processing claims for the Millbrook area for exactly 137 years, despite the fact that the company had been founded in 1988. She found the discrepancy while researching the company's history, hoping to understand why she might be experiencing such severe psychological symptoms, specifically in relation to her work. The official corporate website listed Meridian's founding date as 1988, but archived newspaper articles from the Millbrook Gazette referenced Meridian insurance claims dating back to 1886. Margaret spent her lunch breaks in the town library, scrolling through microfiche records and digitized historical documents. The evidence was consistent and impossible. Meridian Insurance had been operating in Millbrook for over a century, processing claims for accidents, fires, and disasters that had shaped the town's development. But Margaret clearly remembered the company's arrival in 1988, when they had opened their first Connecticut office in the building where she now worked. The historical claims followed familiar patterns: house fires, automobile accidents, slip and fall injuries, property damage from severe weather. But as Margaret studied the records more carefully, she began to notice subtle consistencies that disturbed her. The frequency of accidents never varied significantly from year to year. Despite population growth, infrastructure improvements, and advances in safety technology, Millbrook experienced almost exactly the same number of insurance claims in 1896 as it did in 2006. The types of accidents changed: horse-related injuries giving way to automobile collisions, gas lamp fires replaced by electrical accidents, but the total amount of damage remained remarkably constant. Margaret created spreadsheets, tracking claims data across decades. What she found defied statistical probability. Millbrook's accident rate existed in a state of impossible equilibrium, as if some unseen force was carefully calibrating the precise amount of tragedy required to maintain perfect balance. On January 8th, a Tuesday that felt significant for reasons Margaret couldn't identify, she made a discovery that changed everything. Buried in the historical records was a claim file from 1923 for property damage at 47 Willow Creek Lane. The policyholder was listed as Patricia Hoffman. Margaret stared at the document for a full 10 minutes, her coffee growing cold as she processed the implications. Patricia Hoffman was 34 years old. She had been born in 1989. The claim file from 1923 was impossible. But when Margaret called the records office to verify Patricia's birth certificate, she discovered that Patricia Ann Hoffman had been born on March 15, 1923, in Millbrook General Hospital. The same Patricia Hoffman, who was simultaneously 34 years old and 99 years old, who lived at the same address in claims, filed 8 decades apart. Chapter 7. The Pattern Emerges. On the 13th night, the pattern finally revealed itself in a way that made Margaret understand. She was no longer investigating a psychological disorder or a series of clerical errors. She had been working late again, trying to reconcile impossible discrepancies in the historical records, when she noticed that her current claim files were beginning to repeat information from decades-old cases. Not similar information, identical information. The same addresses, the same policy numbers, the same precise descriptions of damage and circumstances. Margaret laid out claim files across her office floor, arranging them chronologically. What she saw made her understand that she was looking at something that transcended ordinary concepts of time and causality. The claims were cycling. Every 23 years, the exact same accidents occurred in Millbrook. The same houses burned down, were rebuilt, and burned down again. The same intersections witnessed identical collisions. The same individuals filed claims for damage that occurred in precisely the same way, on precisely the same dates, in 23-year intervals stretching back to 1886. Margaret found her own name in records from 1977 and 2000. Margaret Peters, senior adjuster, processing the same impossible claims with the same methodical precision. Her signature was identical across decades, her employee ID number unchanged, her productivity ratings consistently exceptional. She was caught in a loop that had been running for over a century. The Margaret Peters who had worked for Meridian Insurance in 1977 had discovered the same anomalies, conducted the same research, and reached the same impossible conclusions. The Margaret Peters from 2000 had documented the same cycling claims, the same blackout periods, the same gradual realization that reality in Millbrook operated according to rules that had nothing to do with normal concepts of time and space. Every 23 years, Margaret Peters was hired by Meridian Insurance to process claims for accidents that maintained perfect statistical equilibrium in a town where the same tragedies repeated endlessly, where the same people lived and died and lived again, where insurance claims served as the administrative framework for some vast system that required precise amounts of human suffering to continue functioning. Margaret understood now why her memories didn't match the evidence. She wasn't losing her mind. She was recovering it. Every 23 years, she awakened to the same realization, conducted the same investigation, and discovered the same truth. She was a component in a machine designed to process human tragedy with bureaucratic efficiency. Chapter 8. The Scope of the System. 27 days without sleep had taught Margaret that consciousness was negotiable, that the human mind could continue functioning even when reality became completely unreliable. She no longer went home to her house on Maple Street. The building was empty when she drove by, as if she had never lived there at all. Instead, she had taken to sleeping on the couch in her office, surrounded by claim files that documented over a century of carefully orchestrated accidents and disasters. The scope of the system was becoming clear. Millbrook wasn't the only town caught in the cycle. Margaret had identified similar patterns in insurance records from 43 other locations across New England. Small towns where Meridian Insurance had operated for impossible lengths of time, where accident rates remained in perfect statistical balance, where the same tragedies repeated on 23-year intervals. Each location had its own Margaret Peters equivalent, a senior adjuster who processed claims with exceptional efficiency, who experienced blackout periods during which impossible work was completed, who gradually discovered the truth about their role in maintaining the system before being reset to begin the cycle again. Margaret had found records of her counterparts dating back to the 1800s. Different names, identical functions. Sarah Walsh in Millbrook from 1886 to 1909. Catherine Brooks from 1909 to 1932. Margaret Peters from 1932 onward, her employment records seamlessly continuous across decades that should have been impossible. The system was vast, intricate, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. It required precise amounts of tragedy to function properly, house fires that consumed exactly the right amount of property, automobile accidents that injured precisely the required number of people, slip and fall incidents that generated specific dollar amounts in medical claims. Margaret's role was to ensure the quotas were met. During her conscious periods, she processed routine claims and maintained the illusion of normal insurance operations. During her blackout periods, her mind was overridden by something that used her knowledge and skills to adjust the frequency and severity of accidents, ensuring that the statistical requirements were satisfied. She was a thermostat for human misery, calibrated to maintain perfect balance in a system whose purpose remained incomprehensible. Chapter 9. The Choice. As the 49th hour of continuous wakefulness began, Margaret realized she had reached the same decision point that every previous version of herself had faced. She could resist the system, fighting against the blackout periods and the impossible claims, maintaining her sanity by refusing to accept what the evidence clearly demonstrated. This path led to psychological breakdown, psychiatric hospitalization, and eventual reset to begin the cycle again with no memory of what she had discovered. Or she could accept her role, embracing the truth about Millbrook and her function within the larger system. This path led to a different kind of madness. The madness of complete understanding, of seeing the universe as it actually was, rather than as human perception filtered it. Margaret sat in her office chair, surrounded by claim files that documented a century of managed catastrophe, and considered her options. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune, but now she could hear the mathematical precision in their frequency, the way their flickering corresponded to accident rates and claim approval algorithms. Every surface in the office was covered with evidence of the system's operation. Insurance forms from 1886 lay next to contemporary claim files. Historical photographs of accidents showed the same damaged vehicles, the same injured people, the same precise aftermath repeated across decades. Margaret's own signatures, identical across impossible spans of time, authorized payments that maintained the delicate balance between order and chaos. She understood now that consciousness was a luxury the system occasionally allowed its components. Most of the time, Margaret Peters functioned as a perfectly efficient processing unit, reviewing claims and authorizing payments without the burden of awareness. But periodically, the system permitted her to wake up, to see the scope of the operation, to understand her role in maintaining cosmic equilibrium. The awakening always ended the same way. Margaret would choose resistance and be reset, or choose acceptance and be transformed into something that was no longer entirely human. Either way, the Margaret Peters who had spent the past months investigating impossible claims would cease to exist. But this time felt different. This time, Margaret had found something in the historical records that previous versions of herself had apparently missed. Chapter 10, The Deeper Truth. 6 months later, when people asked what had changed, Margaret told them she had simply learned to appreciate the elegant complexity of statistical probability. She returned to work on a Monday morning in February, arriving at 8:15, as always, buying coffee from the machine on the second floor at 8:23. Seated at her desk with her computer booted by 8:30. Her colleagues noticed nothing unusual about her behavior. Margaret processed claims with her typical efficiency, her productivity ratings remained exceptional, and her annual performance review praised her dedication to maintaining Meridian Insurance's high standards of customer service. But Margaret now understood what she was really doing. Every claim she processed was a small adjustment to the probability matrix that governed Millbrook's relationship with chaos. Each approval or denial shifted the balance slightly, increasing or decreasing the likelihood that specific types of accidents would occur in specific locations at specific times. Margaret wasn't just processing insurance claims. She was editing reality itself, fine-tuning the frequency of human suffering to maintain perfect statistical equilibrium. The system was beautiful in its complexity. Margaret could see the mathematical elegance in how individual tragedies connected to form larger patterns, how personal disasters served essential functions in maintaining cosmic stability. Every house fire prevented larger conflagrations. Every automobile accident diverted energy that might otherwise manifest as more catastrophic events. Every slip-and-fall injury absorbed small amounts of entropy that would otherwise accumulate into genuine chaos. Margaret had become conscious of her role without losing her ability to perform it. She experienced both the horror of understanding what she was doing and the satisfaction of doing it with perfect precision. During her conscious periods, she processed routine claims while remaining fully aware that she was calibrating human misery. During her blackout periods, she continued her work with mechanical efficiency, her consciousness temporarily suspended while her body performed the complex calculations required to maintain the system's operation. The other residents of Millbrook lived their lives in blissful ignorance of the forces that shaped their experiences. They believed their accidents were random, their tragedies meaningless, their insurance claims simple financial transactions. They didn't understand that they were components in a vast machine designed to process human suffering with bureaucratic precision, that their individual disasters served essential functions in maintaining the delicate balance between order and chaos. Margaret envied their ignorance even as she took professional pride in the quality of her work. She processed their claims with compassionate efficiency, knowing that each approval or denial was actually an adjustment to the probability matrix that governed their future experiences. She had become the interface between human suffering and cosmic necessity, translating individual tragedies into the statistical language that kept reality functioning properly. In quiet moments, usually late at night when the office was empty and the fluorescent lights hummed their mathematical tune, Margaret wondered about the ultimate purpose of the system she served. Was it maintaining stability for humanity's benefit? Or was humanity simply the raw material from which the system generated whatever it actually needed? The question was fascinating in an abstract way, but ultimately irrelevant to her daily responsibilities. Margaret Peters had learned to find meaning in precision, purpose in processing, and a strange kind of peace in understanding her role as a component in something infinitely larger than individual human experience. She was no longer entirely human, but she was perfectly suited to her function. And every 23 years, when the cycle reset and a new version of herself began to notice impossible details in claim files, Margaret felt a small spark of anticipation. Soon, another Margaret Peters would conduct the same investigation, reach the same conclusions, and face the same choice. The system was patient. The system was eternal. And Margaret Peters was exactly where she belonged. The story of Margaret Peters reminds us that the most effective horror doesn't live in haunted houses or ancient graveyards. It lives in the spaces we consider safe, in the routines we trust, in the certainty that we understand the rules of reality. Long after you've finished listening, you might find yourself paying attention to things you've always ignored, the way shadows fall at slightly wrong angles, how certain conversations develop rhythms that don't quite sound human, that persistent sensation of being observed even in empty rooms. These aren't signs of madness. They're signs of awakening to possibilities your mind has always filtered out for the sake of sanity. If you find yourself unable to quite shake the feeling that something is wrong with the world after hearing tonight's story, if that lingering doubt whispers at the edges of your consciousness, that's not a flaw in the narrative. That's the point. That's the mark of truly effective horror. Let me know in the comments what you liked or disliked about tonight's story. What scared you most, or which moments stayed with you? Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share if you enjoyed tonight's journey into the darkness.